The Mindfulness and Grief podcast offers compassionate insights for coping with grief and life after loss. I'm Heather Stang, author of the Mindfulness and Grief book, and your host for this podcast. Welcome to podcast number 11. And today we have a special guest who has a real firsthand experience with mindfulness and grief. Her name is Laurie Cameron, and she is the author of The Mindful Day, which for those of you watching, I'm holding up the book. For those of you listening, you'll see a picture in the show notes. And Laurie is the founder and CEO of Purpose Blue, and she does mindfulness and leadership consulting for corporations and nonprofits in the United States and in Europe. And of course, she's also a meditation teacher and a wonderful human being. So Laurie, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Heather.
Yeah.
Both of these topics are near and dear to me, mindfulness and grief.
So I'm wondering if maybe you could start us off by sharing a little bit about your grief journey and maybe how mindfulness supported you through it.
Okay, I'd love to. My first impactful experience with loss was when I was a junior in high school. And when I was 16, it was a Saturday morning in November, and my dad suddenly had a heart attack right in front of me. And I happened to be a CPR instructor, but despite that, I was through the Girl Scouts, despite that, I was not able to save him, and he passed away at the hospital. And that experience, which happened so young, turned out really to be quite a gift for me, because it helped me really have a sense of the fragility of life, of just how precious it is, and how impermanent things are. So it was almost surreal in the beginning, but then I started to slowly realize that he's not here. He's not a part of my everyday, my high school, my figuring out which college to go to. And then later, I was 16 then, so 15 years or so later, I was introduced to mindfulness, and I was living in San Francisco now, and beginning my practice and reading books. And I'm actually a student of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Vietnamese master, and I started going on retreats and deepening my practice. And when I was pregnant, 9 months pregnant with my only child, Ava Grace, my brother Johnny suddenly died. Within the space of 3 weeks, I lost Johnny and experienced the most searing grief I'd ever known. And then at the same time, the most exquisite joy I've ever experienced. So I had, the depth of the love, both ends of the continuum mixed together. And then I also lost another brother, and then just 7 years ago, my mother. So I've lost 4 members in my immediate family, as well as grandparents and other beloved people. But these losses they continue to remind me of the beauty and the fragility of life. And I also really deeply appreciate my mindfulness practice and helping me navigate that.
I'm wondering if you could tell us more about the specifics of how your mindfulness practice helps you, because Laurie, that's a lot of loss.
Yeah.
And the intensity, I can't, of course, imagine, of losing your brother right as you're giving birth.
Yeah.
So probably many people listening are just like, how do you get through? How do you cope? And you and I both know that mindfulness is a tool that helps us maybe temper suffering when it happens. It doesn't take away that pain, that pang of loss. But what what did you do in terms of your mindfulness practice?
Well, one of the things that mindfulness helped me do is to sense kind of the early indicators of the tsunami of waves of sadness that come. So by practicing over time, tuning into my body, just really having a sense of the somatic signals or the body signals, I can feel the grief coming or the sadness coming, and then I can do something about it. So often what I would do is just simply breathe or take a walk. I love being in nature. It really grounds me and almost nourishes me like a Mother Earth hug. Uh, so really what I've experienced is that a step one is accessing an inner calm, and it doesn't mean that I'm pushing away the emotion or denying it or avoiding it. It's just almost like an oxygen mask on myself, just feeling the breath, tuning into my body, and just allowing myself, meeting myself with kindness in that moment, and just generating calm. And then mindfulness helped me to relate to my experience with with kind of a wider perspective. And I really appreciate the work of Kristen Neff and Christopher Gammer and their self-compassion research and practices. And one of the things that they offer is this notion of our interrelatedness, our common humanity. And while it was so painful to lose Johnny with this newborn in my hands, I also could find my breath and then remind myself that I'm not alone, that I'm not the first mother of a newborn who's experiencing grief. I'm not the first one to lose their brother and feel like their arm and leg have been removed. I really felt as if I was missing a limb when I lost him. It's a hard thing to describe, but I imagine you or your listeners know that feeling or something like it. So just reminding myself that I wasn't alone really offered me a lot of comfort. So it's understanding my thoughts and being able to actively and deliberately reach for thoughts that would comfort me instead of make me feel worse. Another thing in the thought perspective is that mindfulness helped me see when I would have a thought that would push me down further. So with my brother, I would, a thought would come into mind, if only I had done this, or if only I had helped him this way or that way. And those if only thoughts, or woulda, coulda, shoulda thoughts, as we say in my house, they just increase our suffering. So I think one of the biggest things with mindfulness is after we tend to our breath and body and meet ourselves with kindness, then we can look at the patterns of our mind, our mindsets and habitual ways of thinking. And I had, by that time, been practicing mindfulness for 10 years. So I had developed some strategies and deeper levels of self-awareness at that point. But still, I'm in a lifelong journey. I'm a student of mindfulness. And I could see when those thoughts would come up and the pain they would cause, that they would deepen my pain. And then I could just kind of look at that and say, you don't know that that's true. Kind of bringing in the work of Byron Katie, is that thought helping you right now? What if we turn that thought around? Or how, just kind of working with thoughts from a wider perspective as a witness to what I was experiencing. So that was really helpful, is working with the breath and body, working with thoughts. And, the same when we fast forward, although wasn't that fast, but moving up to when I lost my mom, that was a difficult circumstance because I was living in Europe at that time, living in Germany, and Ava Grace now is 7 years old, my daughter, and we had always planned to come back to Maryland and raise her here like I grew up here. And my mom was, almost every phone call saying, when are you going to bring my granddaughter back here? So we made a big decision to leave our life in Germany, which we really loved. I had no car. I walked everywhere. Had a lot of social connection and time in nature. All the ingredients of well-being we had, and except for sun. And so we sold a lot, packed up a container, bought a house here in Maryland, and my mom suddenly died. And when I got here to Dulles Airport with my husband in one hand and Ava in another, and our golden retriever on a leash, just standing there with our bags, that was really a surreal time because my mom wasn't there. And I came and I worked with my sister to navigate her estate and go through the belongings and also manage my own renovation. And it was really a disorienting, difficult time. And one of the thoughts that would come up early on was the why didn't you move earlier? Kind of the natural thought, I guess, and the kind of replaying, and it's easy to go into the scenario playing, and then that adds to self-judgment or criticism, and it just exacerbates. And I would notice these. I would be able to catch this line of thinking and just stop and breathe and just be with what is. So one of my favorite mindfulness strategies or mindsets is that of acceptance, that things happen and we can, the degree to which we suffer, the degree to which we resist what's happening in our current reality that's beyond our control, that really multiplies our suffering. So that's what I was noticing in that time in 2011, and I would be able to kind of shift that perspective and meet myself with kindness, and I actually, I'm doing it right now because it's so automatic. I put my hand on my chest and I feel the weight of my hand, and I just speak kindly to myself, much like my mother did every day, and just say, what do you need right now, sweetheart? What will help in this moment? And then I thought back as I would take walks and breathe and navigate that hard time, about my bigger intention, my bigger purpose for moving to Maryland. And it was certainly to be with my mom and have her in my daughter's life, but it also had to do with having community and having family and having connection and a strong sense of belonging. So I made that my purpose, that I was going to do what I could do, take skillful action to creating community, whether it was hosting big Thanksgiving dinners to an annual Oktoberfest in the backyard, to becoming, that next year I became the Girl Scout leader for the 3rd grade class and had 19 tents in my backyard with 3rd grade girls.
Wow. That probably took a lot of mindfulness and compassion too.
It did. And a lot of mothers helping, and a Starbucks delivery early the next morning. But, I think that's one of the things we can do. There's a lot of themes or skills coming up here, but not rushing through any of it, just taking our time, one step at a time. And for me, working with the body is usually step 1. So, and then step 2 is the heart. And then step 3 is cognitive strategies of acceptance or impermanence, or taking a wider perspective, or connecting to intention or meaning and purpose. So that's sort of the path that I use and that I teach in my programs and workshops.
And you and I are so much on the same page with that, where the first thing you can tend to is the body, because there is so much of the grief experience that is an out of control experience. You cannot manage it. In fact, our definition of grief in the thanatology world is the uncontrollable response to grief. Wow. And so it's there isn't choice in how the nausea that comes up or the insomnia, but with mindfulness you can have the clear seeing and the wisdom to then make a choice. How can I tend to this? And what I love in what you shared is through that whole journey, you were nurturing yourself. You were, you were really in that space of self-compassion that Kristen Neff and Chris Germer talk about, of self-kindness, common humanity, mindfulness. And
it's interesting because my mother was, I don't like to compare and rank, but I can't help the words that want to tumble out of my mouth is that she was one of the warmest, most nurturing people that I've known. Her mother was a nurse, and maybe there's a lineage of caring there between my grandmother and my mother, just really tuned towards other people and tuning into what would serve here, what would help. I would sit down on a sofa, and I barely sit down, and my mom slides a pillow in the small of my back, or she'll notice that I'm tired, and out of nowhere there's a cup of tea in front of me. So she was very, very nurturing, and for me, I believe that teaching and modeling and conditioning that she gave to me all those years somehow showed up. Somehow she was coming through me and taking care of me with me. And I don't know how to articulate that because I've actually never had that insight before until this very moment. But I think that was really helpful, is that, in her last days, my mom was volunteering in hospice. She was volunteering at NAMI, the National Association for Mental Health. She was volunteering at her church 2 nights a week, taking care, cooking meals on Wednesday and driving people to church on Thursday, and which is where she spent her last evening, going around picking up her neighbors, taking them to church. It was a special pre-Easter service on Maundy Thursday, and that was her last night of being conscious. And that modeling for me and teaching me really paid off when I needed to do that for myself to get through that loss.
Yeah. And that's, a whole legacy she left, an imprint on your life that she left. And that, and not even left, but that still lives, which allows you to stay connected and even pass her on to your child and to your family and your students.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the teachings that I love from in my mindfulness tradition from Thich Nhat Hanh is the teaching that our ancestors are with us and live through us and move through us. So this connection to ancestors is a very active part of our practice. So I was at a monastery, a mindfulness practice center in Mississippi, called Magnolia Grove, and it was a beautiful place, and there were nuns and monks there that had come from a number of monasteries for a week of practice with lay people. And one of the practices that we did that I love so much is to think about our family members and ancestors that have passed, and to take a mindful walk as if we were holding their hands. And I did this there at the monastery, and I actually did that 4 years prior when I was there earlier with Thich Nhat Hanh. And at that time I did it imagining I was holding my brother Johnny's hand, and this time I did it imagining holding my mom in one hand and my brother Johnny in the other. And it's a beautiful practice because I could feel them with me. And also, Thai teaches us to walk mindfully in love and compassion, because many of our family members or dear ones that we've lost might not have learned mindfulness or might not have ever taken a mindful walk. And for me, it's a way to bring them into this nourishing practice and to be with them again. So it's a very soothing thing. I still love to do that, to imagine not only that they're coming through me in their teachings and mannerisms and gestures and passions, which I do carry, but also that they're with me, really with me. And a mindful walk makes that much more than a vague spiritual concept to me. It makes it more tangible.
That's a really beautiful practice, and it's definitely one I'm going to try. And I have a family member, actually my uncle, who died 41 years ago last week. Um, I was 7, but he's always with me, both in the form I knew him in and in the imagined grown-up form. And I think taking a walk with him would be absolutely insightful and lovely. And there will be tears, and that is okay too.
Yeah, the tears feel really good for me when I do the mindful walk with Johnny or Mom or my brother Mark or my dad or my grandparents sometimes. And they're almost like a cleansing. Like in a way, it's like a fresh rain. Like it feels, and it keeps them very present. Because for me, one of the things that's comforting is keeping them present. Yeah. So not letting them get faded too much. Of course, memories fade a little bit, but there are rituals and practices that I do that keep them close together.
Yeah.
Close to me.
And the research shows, and I probably mention this every podcast, but for those who are listening, but the research shows that continuing bonds are so important and so vital to our being able to assimilate the loss. And I think often we think about that in terms of maybe, a year or 2 or 3 or 4 after the loss, but it can be decades. It can be a lifetime. Your grief is going to show up throughout your lifespan.
Yeah.
The tsunami waves are going to eventually maybe turn into more like beach waves where grief is a little further and further apart. The waves of grief, it might be less intense, but you won't stop thinking about them. And, and you won't stop carrying them with you. The mindfulness aspect is, how do you want to carry them with you?
Oh, I think that's really beautiful, the way you just said that. Mindfulness helps us be more in choice in how we carry them. And, one of the things after my mom died, I was in her condominium in Annapolis, and I went out on the balcony one night. We were in the process of sorting and organizing and all those activities that you need to do. And I was out on the balcony, and I looked up at the sky, and I was talking to her. And I had this insight or this sense that I almost can be closer to her than ever, because she was no longer in this form, this human form. And I know this gets into spirituality a little bit, but there wasn't a particular doctrine that I was thinking about. I was raised as a Christian, but I've kind of I don't identify as anything right now. I have a very open way of thinking about what happens to us after we die. But I had this beautiful knowingness that she's actually can be with me anywhere all the time. She's not in a human form. So, that actually is really comforting to me. We had a full moon here last night, and I was outside taking a late full moon walk, as I do every month with my family. And it was just, I can just feel, the connection to people that I love, whether they're with me here or beyond.
Yeah. And, what you're saying about the non-human form, I think of one of our other interviewees, Megan Maloney, who started the Kindness Rocks project. And that began with her just trying to receive wisdom from her parents, and writing down things that she would want them to say to her. And, on rocks, and then she would hide the rocks, and it turned into this, worldwide thing that wasn't really her intention, but it was her being kind to herself, her tapping into her parents. And it sounds so similar to what you're doing with your mother, and probably what I'm doing with my uncle. It's kind of this unconditional, uncontained love and wisdom that still continues that connection that we have, because they're not here physically, but the relationship is continuing.
Yeah, I love hearing that. That's a beautiful practice that she started that turned into something much bigger than her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we can do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about when you talked about the wisdom and the inviting wisdom. One of the practices that I led a group in Monday, I was actually down in Nashville in music country.
Oh, I love
Working
Nashville.
with a team from Deloitte and in a mindful leadership program, and we were exploring self-compassion and how to make that U-turn and how to apply compassion when we need it. And one of the practices that we did is a letter from a mentor, where you think about a difficult situation and you write compassionate words of advice to yourself from a mentor. And a variation on that practice is that we can at any time, use journaling as a way to invite that wisdom from our parents or uncle or brother or people that we've lost. And just journal and just imagine what would they say to you in the situation. And I find that journaling or sitting and inviting my mom to sit along with me or my brother Johnny, I call on them depending on the scenario that I'm in. Just like in real life, you would call on your brother differently than you would your mom, probably.
Right.
But I think we can have these structures and routines that invite that wisdom, even when we can't physically touch them anymore.
Right. What a beautiful turn this is all taking, this conversation, because, here we sit down to talk about mindfulness and grief, and you're taking us to a place we haven't really talked about much on this podcast before, which is, the how to actually practically stay connected. Not just honoring their memory, not just sharing memories, but keeping it here. And that's what mindfulness is, right? It's about being in the present and being awake and to what's alive in this moment. As Tara Brach often says, what's alive right here. And so I'm so grateful for you, sharing your story with us, sharing that very particular exercise of walking with them in nature. And I'm wondering, because I love your book, by the way. We did it for book club at the Frederick Meditation Center, and you were so kind to come and do a book talk for us. I'm going to hold up the book again. And I know that a lot of what your time is spent doing is mindfulness and leadership for corporations, but this book is great for anybody who has a day, anyone who has 24 hours a day, which would be everybody. And one of the things I love about your style of teaching is that you make the practices easy to access. They're not, you don't feel like you have to commit, 2 hours a day to sitting practice or something like that. It's how do you weave it in to your life and make it a lifestyle, not so much a task or obligation. And so I'm wondering if you'd be
that is my mission.
Well, you have accomplished it in your book, and I'm wondering if maybe you wanted to share just a little bit about the book, and maybe what listeners could get out of this book, whether they're if they're grieving, how would this apply to them?
Oh yeah, thank you. My purpose in the book that I shared with National Geographic, the publisher, was to write a book that translated all the teachings of mindfulness and positive psychology and compassion, and to actually back all of that up with research and evidence. So it's not just a book of advice or kitchen table wisdom, but a lot of it is kitchen table wisdom, but we're seeing the evidence of that in the neuroscience lab. So it's evidence-based, but there's 50 chapters or 50 entries that take you through a day, from the time that you wake up in the morning to take a shower, to have your breakfast or exercise or sit and breathe or step outside, to commute to work and greet your colleagues, or if you work at home, creating your space, and all the things that happen at work. And whether you work alone or work in an office, we get overwhelmed. We need to focus. We have to navigate difficulty. We have to have difficult conversations. If you're a volunteer or you're, a stay-at-home dad or a parent or whatever you do, all those entries are equally applicable because the book is written around situations. So the situations that we meet or that we experience as a human being. So from waking up to going to bed. And we structured it in 5 sections. So I've got home, starting the day, and then work, and then play. So all the things we do in our spare time, in our leisure, to invite back kind of an old-fashioned word, but we can be kind of careless and let our leisure moments get eaten up, or we can be very purposeful and intentional and mindful about how we spend our time so that we have connection and nature and hobbies and creativity. And then I have a whole section on love, and that has to do with relationships. And we know that the key pillar in resilience and well-being is the degree to which we have fulfilling and meaningful social connection, whether it's someone that you wake up to in your bed every morning, or whether it's your friends or colleagues or neighbors. So mindfulness is a superpower. It's an amazing skill to cultivate to deepen connection. So there's a whole section on love, and then a section on home and how we can intentionally cultivate structures, so how we set up our home, but also how we invite routines and habits and ways of being that help us to be present and use our senses and connect with each other with intention and create community. So all the research on well-being, I'm a senior fellow at George Mason at the Center for the Advancement of Well-being, and the research we know about what cultivates well-being in humans can be turned into, and what the book does is translate that into practical ways we can do it in the lives we have right now. I go to mindfulness monasteries and retreats and in France and the US, but not everybody wants to do that or has the time to do that on their vacation breaks. So what I did is translated what I learned in the last 20 years as well as the research so that people could have really accessible ways to figure out this, what can sound kind of conceptual or mysterious, this word mindfulness, just translate it into what it means every day.
Thank you for sharing that. Because, one of the first things I thought of when you said how there's the section on work is how as grieving people, most people get 3 days off. And then you have to go back to work. Or you have to start working because you lost your main source of income if a spouse or partner.
Yeah.
And so, finding little moments in the workday or in the commute to get centered and to be more present and mindful can actually really shift the attitude. It doesn't necessarily mean if you're, in the early days, weeks, months, year of grief, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be joyous, right?
Right.
Grief will still be there. But back to what you were saying earlier about how resistance creates suffering.
Yeah, absolutely. And the resistance, and also over time we can shift how we relate to the sadness or the pain. Mm-hmm. So over time I started to feel in my body, when I felt that wave of grief for my brother Johnny, that was a really powerful one. I would feel that and I would say to myself, okay, there's the love that Johnny and I shared. We used to tell people we were twins. We were less than 2 years apart. We're both born in March. And, I would just feel it as love. It's almost like an embrace, like a reminder, like how lucky I was to have a brother like that who loved me so completely, and I him. And so I would start to relate to the grief differently. Like, yes, I miss them, but I'm also reminded of how much we loved each other.
So you're able to hold the love and the pain in the same place, because we often think of love and grief as two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. You
Yeah.
don't grieve those that you did not love. And
That's
if you
right.
love, you will grieve. And so the mindfulness, I often think of mindfulness as the big ampersand, the and sign. And
Yeah.
the love and the grief simultaneously.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I think of them as simultaneously, and now it's almost like it's lost a duality. It's just kind of one thing. One amorphous, boundaryless entity, like a cloud, and all of that's in there together.
Laurie, if people want to get a hold of you or find out what you have coming up or watch your TEDx speech, find your book, where would we go to seek you out?
Well, thank you, Heather. I invite each of your listeners to join my community. They can do that on my website, lauriejcameron.com. That's LAURIE Cameron, CAMERON.com, or at Purpose Blue. That's PURPOSEBLUE.com. And my community is just a great way to deepen their learning and practice and experience. I write a newsletter about 2 times a month and share short video clips and practices and just ways that I'm learning and experimenting with mindfulness practices and what I'm discovering as well. Also, I'm really active on Instagram. So I'd love to invite them to join me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. I really love community. I think it helps us sustain our practice and learn and deepen and experience what you and I shared, which is we're not in this alone. We're all fellow travelers. As Ram Dass says, we're all walking each other home. So we can do it together.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Laurie. Yes. So I have the URL up on the screen, and if for those of you who are listening, you can access the show notes at mindfulnessandgrief.com. Just click on the podcast link. And again, lauriejcameron.com or purposeblue.com. And as we close out, do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom you'd like to give our listeners to carry with them from today?
Yeah, I guess the thing is that your listeners are experiencing grief in one form or another. And in my journey with grief, I've realized that it's been such a phenomenal gift and that I have such a deep appreciation for this life and the preciousness of this beautiful life and the moments of the day to see wonder and beauty and joy and to treat each person as if it might be the last time I talk to them. I'm very intentional when I say goodbye to my family in the morning, and not in a sad or paranoid way, in a loving, present way, that this life is short and those of us who know grief have a deep inner knowing of that, and that whatever we practice gets stronger. So practice being present and connecting with people with an open heart. That's my final thing I'd love to share.
Thank you, Laurie. It's a beautiful practice. Namaste.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for the Mindfulness and Grief podcast. If you found the information helpful, please help others find us by rating, reviewing, or subscribing to this podcast wherever you download your favorite shows. For additional grief support, including free guided meditations, visit us on the web at mindfulnessandgrief.com and consider adding the Mindfulness and Grief book to your self-care toolkit. Special thanks to our sound engineer, Todd Campbell of Hub City Recording, and to the Atomic Mosquitoes for our theme music. I'm Heather Stang, and I hope these teachings will be of great benefit to all who receive them. Until next time, Namaste.